Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm really pleased to be doing this. I'm feeling pretty much in the holiday spirit. I was telling Charlie earlier I had to go out there and remove 5 inches of snow from my driveway, and so I decided to go with the holiday backdrop here. That's not a fake backdrop. Yes, Santa Claus did come early, and he threw up all over my den, so as you can see. So we're definitely in the holiday spirit here in my household. But thanks again for joining us, and it's always a pleasure to work with Nikon members on this type of a topic, HR. It's my baby, and I hope it's yours too. But today's webinar has to do with basically, the critical HR elements in a small nonprofit. And let's first jump into what it is we're going to be covering this morning. We're going to talk about a little bit about what you're up against and being a nonprofit, all the different challenges that you have. But we're going to try to meet some of those challenges through developing a competency in human resources. And once you've earned those competencies and understand what they are, then we're going to talk about some of the elements regarding HR that are critical to your business. We're going to look at various subject areas and just give a very brief overview of the kind of things that the challenges in those areas and what kind of systems you may want to have in place. So starting off, we've all, you've been in nonprofits for a while. I've been in nonprofits for a long time, and it's pretty much the same story of whether you're a large nonprofit or a small one. You always have a tight budget, right? Either you're not big enough to have an HR function, or you don't have enough money. You'd love to have somebody who's dedicated to human resources, but you simply can't afford it, or you're just not large enough to justify it. So as a result, you're understaffed, and if you do have anybody in your HR function, they were usually the probably last person hired. Like in a lot of organizations, and it's not just nonprofits, HR is usually one of the last functions to see investment. It's administrative role. You want to get your finance function done first. Then you go, you know what? It's kind of an afterthought. I might need to actually do some HR stuff here. So it is usually the last function to see investment. And, historically, sometimes, the wrong people end up in an HR role. It's getting a little bit better, I think, nowadays. But in the past, if someone was a people person, or if they got along with people or they're well liked, we said, hey, you belong in HR. Well, like any discipline, you want to have people that are qualified and not just nice people. So that's one of the other things you're up against. And then finally, HR in general is kind of misunderstood. And again, I think it's changing, but traditionally, HR has been seen as an administrative function, kind of a back office function, transactional in nature, not necessarily adding a lot of value. My little alliteration here, paper pushing picnic planners. HR used to be, well, that's the person that you go for employee relations and to make sure everybody's kept happy. Obviously, it's so much more than that, especially in this kind of an environment, New York State especially, with so many different legal ramifications and so many things to look out for. So these are all the things that you're up against. So, you've got other organizational issues that you may be dealing with. For example, concentration of authority. Depending on the size of the organization, sometimes it seems that the only person who can make a decision is the executive director. And that's kind of tough. Decisions can't get made quickly then if that's the case. What ends up happening is that if you don't have a lot of resources, you end up with your managers and your key people wearing a lot of hats. So as a result, it's hard for them to become a functional expert in anything, but especially if it's HR. And oftentimes you find it may be, perhaps we have executive directors here on this webinar, we may have finance people, and they end up with the responsibility of the HR function. And when you do it part-time, it's hard to become an expert. Communication, every organization has issues with communication, even if you're the best at it. But oftentimes we're not delivering enough of the important information, too much mundane information, the wrong person delivering the message. Communication is always a challenge, and having someone in HR can certainly help with that. and strategic planning. Larger organizations are a little bit better at this, but the reality is we're so busy working on today and working on the business, in the business, I should say, we're not really working on the business and looking forward to the future and developing a good strategic plan. We're simply too busy dealing with today's problems. So this is my way of saying I've been there and dealt with it all. We know there's a lot of challenges to running a nonprofit. Oh, and finally, succession planning. You know, again, there may not be ample opportunity to develop people in your organization to assume that next level role, probably because you don't have a whole lot of layers. So these are all issues that survive around that HR area. And so how do you meet these challenges? You know, I mentioned that it's oftentimes there's a person who has a regular day job, and they're the ones that are actually doing the HR function. But regardless of who it is who's going to be fulfilling that role, the best way to be successful in terms of managing HR is to develop some key competencies. So we're going to discuss these 5 competencies in a little bit more detail. First is leadership. Basically, it really helps to have somebody in the organization who can understand the different styles of leadership. You know, we've all worked for executive directors who have different styles. Some are very collaborative. They want to involve everyone in the decision-making process. Some are kind of top-down, a little bit more authoritarian. Well, it helps to have people who can understand those different styles of leadership and how then to help the organization respond, how to help employees understand it, and how to work within that leadership style. I think it also helps that if someone's going to undertake the HR function, that they show their own leadership by committing to the discipline and to the function. Some ways to do that are to go out and formally get an education in it. Nowadays, they do have an HR major that you can get in business schools. But I think certification is also very important. Like a lot of different disciplines, there are organizations out there who will certify people in HR. You take a test, you study for the test, you take a test, and then you have this certification, and you maintain it through continuing education. And then also association membership. There are a lot of HR organizations out there. The biggest one is SHRM, the Society for HR Management. That's a national organization, but they also have local chapters. There's one in the Albany area. I'm sure there's several throughout the state, which I belong to. And it's a great way to tap into resources, for people who do what you do and they understand HR, and it's a great opportunity to get information and assistance when you have an issue. But whoever's doing the HR function too, I think it's important to act almost like an internal consultant. It's somebody who can be objective about issues and be able to see both sides of an equation and assist the executive director or high-level manager in dealing with HR issues. And that's where being able to challenge authority comes in. It's not easy for a lot of people to look to their boss and say, we should be taking a different approach here, or you might want to think twice before you make that decision in HR, because these could be the possible ramifications. I think it's good to have somebody in the HR role who can feel comfortable challenging authority. Once I get through these slides, I'll take a quick look and see if there's any questions coming up. But if we don't get to them during the presentation, we're happy to take some time toward the end to address them. Next one is knowledge of the business. I think that if you're going to be a leader at all in a business, you need to understand all the dynamics of the business that you're in, both external and internal. So external, I'm talking about clients, I'm talking about a regulatory environment. For example, if you're in human services, there may be a number of regulatory bodies that oversee your operations. It's good to have a good idea as to what those external threats and opportunities are. But internally, it's also very important that you understand the business. Understand the business plans. If you have a strategic plan, understand that, understand where the function fits in. It's a great idea to understand finance. I know most people in HR, aren't that great at understanding finance, but finance and HR are inextricably attached because usually the biggest expense in a nonprofit is going to be your people. So it's very important that the HR person and the finance person are on the same page. So I guess it's a lot easier if the HR person is the finance person. That makes it a lot easier. But also understand, the organization structure and how there may be challenges presented by that. And I actually kind of tip my hat on this one, the strategic HR thinking. I think it's important to understand where the human resource function fits in to the strategic planning process. I've assisted a number of organizations with their strategic plans, and I don't think there's one strategic plan that I've seen that hasn't had at least one strategic initiative around recruiting and retaining the right kind of people. Because the reality is, again, especially in nonprofits, if you don't have the right people in place, you're not going to be able to achieve your goals. So you want somebody in the HR function who understands where the function fits in strategically with the organization. Process skills. This is, every discipline has its systems, right? Finance, there's finance systems, there are HR systems as well. And I think having a competency that enables someone to, essentially look at an existing process. It could be your recruiting process, let's say, from start to finish. How long does it take for me to identify a candidate and then get them in the door behind their desk? Evaluate a process, and to be able to critically look at it, identify weaknesses, bottlenecks, various other issues, recommend improvements, and then make that system more efficient. And then even to the point where you can establish goals and start measuring, how you've improved that system. Years ago, I went into an organization and couldn't understand why it took so long to get people in the door. And we went through step by step what was involved in the current process and found a couple of bottlenecks where literally a resume was sitting on somebody's desk for a week before they ever got to it. Sometimes the simplest thing can really turn around a process and make it more efficient. And having that competency is very useful. Lastly, technology and HRIS. HRIS is Human Resource Information Systems. If you're a small business, maybe this isn't as important, but certainly as you grow, it can make you more efficient. If you're dealing with paper systems constantly and how you process new employees and how you process benefits and how, again, there's a lot of transactional things in HR, and you don't want to spend your time dealing with all of that. You'd really want to spend your time adding value to the organization. As a result, sometimes you need to turn to human resource information systems and other forms of technology to help make a process more efficient. You can identify trends. It's when you have good information that you can provide management about any HR issue. Turnover is an excellent example. If you do the right kind of exit interviews and things, and you gather that information, you can start to build a picture that says people are leaving for these reasons, and then you can literally take that information, make it actionable, and implement, retention initiatives that are based on reality, and they line up with why your people leave. So that's an example of, using technology and HRIS to help make a system more efficient. So now that you've got all these HR competencies, let's turn around and start seeing what are the critical human resource elements that we should have in place. I'm going to do a quick stop right now and just see. Charlie, can you tell me if there are any questions out there that I might have an opportunity to address?
There's one question that is marked for later. Want to know the steps for a nonprofit to hire an executive director. In my case, I'm secretary of a board, but hope to transition off the board and be hired as the first ED. So maybe that's for later.
Oh, interesting. Actually, I will address that a little bit later because, like we anticipate, it's likely that some early questions we may be able to get to later on. And there's a section here I talk about talent acquisition. It's a little unique for an executive director, but I can give some additional guidance on that. So now that we know what it is we're looking for in terms of the person, whoever that person is, even if it's not their full-time job, to deal with the HR function, we've talked about some competencies that they should have and that the organization should have relative to HR. But now let's look at some actual systems that should be in place. This sounds very basic, but you'd be surprised at how many organizations have difficulty kind of clarifying what their organization looks like. I talk about organization charts and people goes, I know who reports to who. I know where all that stuff is. Well, maybe you do, but maybe not everybody does. And it's critical that everybody in the organization has a handle on what the reporting structure is like, what the chain of command is like. So I think it's important to have organization. And of course, you also may be in an industry where you need to show this to your funding or other regulatory bodies. So I think it's important to have everybody in the organization should have a title. You should have a reporting structure that people understand so that everybody who's in the organization knows who their boss is and who they need to go to when they have an issue. In small organizations, it's actually a little bit tougher, believe it or not, because everybody thinks they report to the executive director. That may not be the case. I've also seen situations where people say, I have two bosses and I'm not sure I'm getting my guidance. Well, I always recommend give everybody one boss and make sure that they're accountable to that person. So it seems pretty basic, but org chart goes a long way. Job descriptions also. This is an incredibly important document, because it's the foundation for so many other HR functions. For example, how can you go out and recruit a position? How can you go out and advertise if you don't have a job description? You have to be able to say, here's what the job entails. Here's what the primary functions are. You also have to be able to say, we need these qualifications. In order for you to be successful in this role, you should have this degree, or you should have this amount of experience, or you should have a background in this competency. So, it's important for the recruitment process. It's also very important for the performance appraisal process. When you think about performance appraisal, you're actually setting an expectation up front. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but you're setting an expectation and then you're going to hold somebody to that expectation. Well, if they don't have a job description, it's kind of very basic to say, this is what your job is comprised of, and this is what I expect of you. Compensation is another one. I talked about recruiting and mentioning that you have to identify what kind of qualifications someone has. Well, out in the labor market, certain qualifications carry a certain price tag. You'd like to think that a master's degree would probably pay more than an associate's degree. But when it comes to how you compensate your people, obviously you'd like to have an objective measure, an objective document that you can say, in this job description, there are a number of compensable factors, and that's why this position makes the range of pay that it does. And then finally, legal compliance. Certainly in this day and age, you want to be able to comply with all the laws, federal and state. And the job description could actually help with some of that. A very clear example would be determining someone's status, their FLSA status, the Fair Labor Standards Act status. This is where I'm talking about the exempt versus non-exempt, right? I have learned in dealing with a lot of NICON members and especially smaller organizations, sometimes they struggle with this. They struggle with determining, is this position exempt or non-exempt? Well, a well-done job description can help justify an exemption if you decide to take that exemption. How that job description is laid out, how it examines the functions and the duties of that position go a long way toward justifying taking an exemption if you do. And there's other legal issues regarding job descriptions, but I think I've kind of beat up on job descriptions enough. It's a very important foundational document. Recruitment and selection. This is obviously a big subject matter area within HR. In fact, some people spend their entire careers in this one subset of human resources, which is recruitment and selection. Talent acquisition is the more current phrase, I should say. But you want to make sure that in your organization you have some processes in place surrounding the whole recruitment process. For example, consistent advertising. You are going to have to go out and, Indeed is a great spot. There may be individual trade associations that you may find are very specific to your industry that you'd want to source your candidates. The point is you want to source candidates first. What's important about how you do that is that you want to maintain a certain brand identity, because just like we sell a product out into a marketplace, when you're recruiting, you're trying to sell something to the labor market. Excuse me. You should know who you compete with. When you're out there advertising for talent and trying to acquire talent, you want to reflect a certain brand. You want to reflect a certain yeah, an organizational how I want to put it, image that somebody's really going to want to go work for. So it's important that your advertising be pretty consistent. When you get to the point of applicant screening, you want to be able to make sure that you're using the right kind of criteria to do that initial screening. You could run an ad and get 50 people, and on average, maybe 10 to 15% are qualified. 15 if you're lucky. But you have to have a way of going, okay, this person not qualified, not qualified. You've got to be objective about that. You don't want to get in any trouble. So you want to make sure that you're reviewing and screening out your applicants initially correctly. Once you've gotten to a set of candidates that you feel are qualified, you should have an interviewing process that's relatively robust and fairly consistent. For example, I always recommend, if you've narrowed it down to, let's say, 4 or 5 people, a half a dozen maybe, doing a phone screen is a very efficient way of further weeding out any unqualified people. You may have a series of critical questions that you'd like, critical things that you're looking for in a candidate, and you can easily determine if somebody has those qualities through a phone screen. Not only that, being able to talk to somebody over the phone, you can tell if they've got a personality, you can tell if they can communicate well. So there's a lot that you can get out of a telephone interview, or even it's a Zoom interview like this, which is much more efficient. So now let's say you've made your choice, right? You want to have a process whereby you make an offer in a certain consistent way. You may do that verbally. I always think it's a great idea to have an offer letter once you've gotten to a point where it's perfectly fine to offer somebody a role over the position. To offer someone a position over the phone. But I always like to follow up with an offer letter, because you want to make sure there's no misunderstandings. You don't want somebody to quit their job and come work with you and then get there and say, I didn't realize this is what my job entailed, or I thought I was going to get 2 weeks vacation or 3 weeks vacation. You want to be able to outline some of those things in an offer letter. Once somebody gets in the door, you want to have a system around their onboarding process. There's a lot of things we throw at people on that first day. They're signing a whole bunch of this, they're reading a whole bunch of that. It'd be nice to have some organization to that, to make sure that you've hit all the things that you're supposed to, you're complying with all the rules around this, and little checklists are great in HR. I'll tell you, I have a checklist for just about every function in HR. That's getting somebody in the door. Then you have orientation and training. And that's, every organization is going to be different. Every position is going to have a different path, more than likely. So you may have orientation that speaks to, here's what you can learn about the whole organization. And then you hand someone off to a supervisor or a mentor, for example, to actually help with their training as it pertains to their actual role. So that's where things like, mentorship sometimes works. I've built some mentor programs. Some can get too complicated and bureaucratic. I don't recommend that. You just want to give somebody a buddy, somebody that they can go to so they don't have to bother their supervisor all the time, who can guide them through the more mundane aspects of the job, but also to help give them some information on how to find things and orient themselves. So it's always good to have that constant check-in, because you may not realize it, maybe you do, that as soon as somebody basically reads an ad and goes through this entire recruitment and selection process, all of this has a real big impact on retention later on. I've been through it myself. You've probably been in some jobs where in the first couple of days you sit there and you go, oh my gosh, have I made a mistake? Why? Because they screwed this process up right here. And it kind of sets you off on the wrong foot. The organizations that have this process pretty much down and they're successful at it and they have a robust process are going to set themselves up much better in the future to help with employee retention. So, first impressions they call them that for a reason. And this is your first impression. For the question that was asked about the executive director, the CEO recruiting, that this process applies, but there's obviously going to be some tweaks to it. Normally, the process would be that your board president, it could be your executive committee, or your board may want to establish a search committee. Okay, that'd be one of the first things that your board should do. You want to make sure that your executive director's job description is well developed. You also want to make sure that you hire someone. It could be a consultant like me. It could be, it's difficult to have the internal HR function actually do the search for an executive director. Why? Because they have a vested interest. So it's always a good idea to engage, perhaps with a search firm to do that. They can then help with that process. You want to make sure that the pay is at market based. You want to make sure that members of the board have an opportunity to, meet and interview any of the candidates that come through. But my first step would be, I think, to determine who on the board is going to assist with that from an oversight standpoint. I call it a search committee. But I think it's a great idea to engage with a professional like an HR consultant like myself or a search firm to assist with that process so that you do a thorough search. It's a very important position to fill. I hope that answers your question. If not, we can certainly connect later. The next system, I guess I'd like to discuss is performance management. I mentioned this earlier, and I mentioned also, when we talk about job descriptions and reporting structures, the performance management process is actually very simple. It's a 3 or 4 step process. The first step is to clarify the roles and responsibilities. Yes, this is where a job description comes into place, but it also, things like setting goals, for example, comes into play. This is all part of clarifying what someone's responsibilities are. Setting those performance expectations. That is that, yes, you know what your position is. I've got a job description, you know your role, but we want to actually accomplish something. So I think it's important that you are able to set additional performance expectations. That could be in the form of a set of goals that at the beginning of the year, you sit down and work out, you want these 3 or 4 things that you want to accomplish in the upcoming year. So these first 2 have to do with clarifying what it is that you expect from that person, and they understand exactly what you expect. And hopefully they have a role or play a part in setting those expectations as well. Next step is to measure or appraise that performance. Now that you've set the expectations, let's look at what you did. We're going to match the 2 against what I expected from you. Lots of organizations will use a form for this. This process can take many different forms. Typically, people do have something that they fill out. Could be a rating system, right? 1 through 5. 5 says you're the best thing since sliced bread. 1 says you probably should start looking for another job. People tend to go toward those numerical ones because it's an easy way to gauge, right? So that's how you can measure that performance, but it's important. I won't get too much into this, but it's important when you're doing performance reviews that you justify, the ratings that you give someone. There are all kinds of things they call rater errors when it comes to doing performance appraisals. And if you're going to give somebody a 5, you better be able to identify, put comments in, and clearly state why you think they rated that high. What did they actually achieve? How much better than what your expectation was did they do? So you want to be able to justify any comments that you make and any ratings that you make, regardless of what the different criteria is that you're measuring. There's nothing worse than getting a performance review with all threes and no comments. And trust me, it happens all the time. It happens because the manager who's writing the performance appraisal doesn't want to have to justify one way or another that somebody's better than average or worse than average. They just want this to go smoothly. That's what you got to be on the look for. And then, of course, once you've done the performance appraisal, then comes the management part. Okay, now that we know how you did against expectations, how do we respond? What's our next step? If someone's doing particularly poorly, there may be, forms of discipline, perhaps. There may be corrective measures that you want to put into place. If you identify certain areas in a performance appraisal where someone's particularly weak, I think it's very important that at the end of your appraisal, whatever that form or mechanism looks like, that you have something called a development action plan, that you say, we've identified these issues that you need to improve on, so let's put a plan together as to how we're actually going to do that. Sometimes they also call that a performance improvement plan, or a PIP, which basically says, here's where your performance is deficient. Again, here's what we're going to, we're setting goals for you to improve on that. And here are the tools that we as your employer are going to provide you in order to help you get there. It's a two-way street, performance. If someone fails in their job, I always say management has got just as much responsibility as the employee does, because either we didn't clarify the responsibilities, we didn't give them the tools they need. So it's definitely a collaborative process when someone is not performing in order to try to get them to improve. On the other hand, if someone's doing a great job, generally, it'd be great if you could provide some kind of a reward, which can take many different forms. Could be a slap on the back, hey, great job. It could be public recognition, some kind of an award. Could be a pay raise. And I know a lot of organizations, especially nonprofits, that's not always easy to do. But the reality is good performance does deserve reward. And people don't work always because they just love it and do it for intrinsic benefits. They do it because they want to put bread on the table, and providing additional compensation based on that performance is a great way to continue to expect good performance when you properly reward people.
Hey, John, there was a question before we move on. For performance management, can the annual performance review be completed by HR, or does it need to be done by a supervisor? How do you determine the coordination if there are two distinct roles, the supervisor and HR person involved?
Yeah, without a doubt. Thanks, Charlie, for that. And thanks for the question. The performance management system is in the domain of HR, but HR does not execute them. HR works collaboratively with managers. Okay, so if you have a large organization, you may have a lot of managers, and they may have a lot of direct reports. It is without a doubt, it is their role and their function to actually appraise their performance. What HR provides is the tools and the system to do that. So HR would guide all these managers, and now we're doing our annual reviews. You need to do your review by, March 15th. Here's the form that you're going to use. Here's the process that you're going to use. I think it's very, very, it's important that HR lead the process by also training managers on how to do a good review. I mentioned earlier that there's things called rater errors and rater bias, okay? Some people, like I said, they call it the central tendency, where I'm going to give everybody a 3. They have something called the halo effect, the horn effect, which means the halo effect is if you're good at one particular thing, I think you're great at everything. Not necessarily the case. And the horn effect is the opposite. So I think HR plays the role of developing the system, providing those tools, and providing the training to your managers so that they know how to do a good review. After the reviews are done, I always, in any role I've had in HR, and even as a consultant, I would always say, when you're finished with your review, send it to me. and that's me being in HR. I think HR can also play the role of quality control. The reality is you have 5 different managers. These 5 people are going to have 5 different styles. Some are going to be really difficult to please. I call them, they're the hard asses, right? They're the ones that you really got to work hard to get a 4 out of them if it's a numerical rating. But they rate hard because they have high expectations. And on the other hand, you're going to have the cupcakes, I call them. They don't want to upset anyone. They want to be everyone's friend. They're the ones that are going to give everybody 5s and say, you're the best thing since sliced bread. Well, I think before those reviews get discussed with the employee, I think it's important for there to be an objective person, hopefully an HR person, who can review those and kind of make sure that we're not too much one side or the other. Make sure that when you rate somebody a certain way, that you have a comment there that will justify that rating. If I give you a 5, I better be able to show 15 ways that you just, stood on your head and did, did backflips. So it's important that even from that perspective, that there's consistency within the review, and then consistency among the reviewers. So that's where I think HR can also play a role. But it's a long-winded answer to your question, that it's important that HR provide the tool in the system and the guidance and training, but the execution is from the manager. So that's performance management. Next part, comp and benefit. Oh, is there another one? Okay, thank you.
There is, yes. And you may be covering this later, but how does an ED get reviewed?
Well, it's, this same process actually, the same process applies but what normally happens is that your executive director, hopefully your board president or your executive committee of your board have established a set of goals for your executive director. So they get rated just like anyone else, and you can use the same system if you want to do the executive director. It's just that it's usually the board president who is completing the review, and they're going to have these expectations at their available to them to measure the executive director against. Usually there's going to be goals set out for an executive director. So the process is essentially the same. It's just that the board or usually it's the board president or the executive committee that's completing the review and discussing it with the executive director. So when I mentioned reward, you've got a good performer, how do you reward them? Compensation is a great way to do it. But compensation in itself is an entire subject and discipline within HR. There are people who do nothing but compensation and benefits for their entire career. Compensation, you want to make sure, the thing with compensation is you want to make sure you're fair, right? If you're large enough, it'd be great to establish, some kind of a compensation matrix, which essentially establishes for groups of positions, it establishes pay ranges. And those ranges are based upon what I call compensable factors. Things like, educational attainment, how many people you supervise. There's all these things that are laid out in the job description that would also help place a position within a certain grade if you have, this kind of a system. Not everybody has it. And if you're small, you don't really need it. But the point behind it is that every now and then, you need to make sure that what you're paying people is where you are against market. So periodically you want to go out and survey the market. And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier nowadays. Ever since the New York State law changed and said that if you advertise a position, you have to put the pay range in there. It's probably put a lot of compensation experts out of business, because now clients call me and they say, can you tell me what a good program manager goes for? I go out on Indeed, I find 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 comparables, and I go, boy, I can target it. Here's the range. So now it's out there for you to see, but it's also out there for your employees to see. So you want to make sure that you're paying at market, or if you decide to pay lower than that, great. You have the benefits to make up for it, but you still at least need to know where you are relative to market. Obviously, you have financial boundaries, and we would love to give everybody 15% raises and pay at the top of the market. We simply can't afford it. But you need to, this is where that relationship with your financial person really comes in handy to understand what your financial boundaries are with regard to your pay mechanisms. But you always, if you're going to make pay adjustments, okay, some organizations will do across the board. I call it ATB, across the board pay. Everybody gets 3% or 4%. Or if you just do COLAs, same concept. Or if you have merit pay, right? You may have a merit pay system where the good performers are going to get 5% and the mediocre ones get 2%. That's great. You connect performance with pay. But either way you do it, you want to make sure that you constantly know where you are against the marketplace out there with your competitors. But you also want to make sure that you're paying equitably internally. If you've got 4 people that are in exactly the same job, they all have exactly the same credentials and the same experience, they should probably be making pretty much the same. But if you've got 2 people in your organization, one has a master's degree and one has an associate's degree, it's okay if that master's degree person is paid at a higher level, even though they may have the same job. So internal equity is something that people struggle with a lot, but it's important to understand if there are differences in pay for the same job or similar job, that you can justify those differences. Benefits, again, it's a whole nother area that people spend their entire careers in. But I think what I've learned is that you need to know your employees, because certain things are important to employees, certain things are not important to others. For example, if you have a very typically young workforce, a generous health plan may not be that big a deal to them. They may not value it as much as someone who might be a little bit more mature. Why? Because the young ones are going to live forever. They'd rather get the pay in their paycheck. Thanks for the benefit, but I'm not going to use it. It's the same thing with retirement. In organizations that have younger employees, they're not generally as concerned about the retirement. Why? Because they got 40 years to go. Whereas with other employees, it may be more important. So know your employees and what's valuable to them. And I often suggest doing surveys, which I think may be on another slide. But you want to make sure you've got all the right basic insurances in place and that you've got time off and flexibility. That's the main thing nowadays for employees. They want flexibility. After the pandemic, everybody got used to working from home, and they want to see that kind of flexibility. So you also need to, in this area, there's a whole lot of mandated time off in New York State. You want to make sure when you're looking at leave time that you're checking all the boxes when it comes to all the different rules and regulations in New York. I'm going to jump ahead here because we're coming. And this is employee relations and compliance, I think, is one of the is another area of HR. And the first and most important document when it comes to employee relations is the employee handbook. I do a lot of handbooks for my clients, and it's important that you have something that outlines the rules of engagement when it comes to the employment relationship. An employee handbook is a great way to do that. It needs to be tailored to your employees. It needs to be in a language that they can understand. Remember, your audience with a handbook are your employees. It's not the attorneys. It's not the managers or the board. It's your employees, and it should be written in a way that they understand. You're going to want to have things in there about their benefits, for example, all the different employment policies that you have, as well as all the expectations for performance that you have. Open door, you want to make sure that there's at least a perception that management's listening and that people, have avenues that if they try to work something out with their boss, that they have somebody that they can go to. Whistleblowers in New York State, this is basically a rule for every organization. Used to be just for nonprofits of a certain size, but really everybody should have a whistleblower policy. And all that really entails is that if an employee feels that they think the organization is breaking the law or other regulation that they're supposed to comply with, that they have a process that they can go through to see that the executive director, and if the executive director is the issue, that they have an avenue that they can go to the board or some member of the board to express their concerns and have them looked into. And obviously, I think it's always important to have access to consultants and attorneys. That's not just for me to drum up business, but every organization should have a labor attorney. You have attorneys for various other matters, corporate matters. I think if you've got access to a labor attorney, you're always going to be in good shape if you get to a point where you really want to get some advice before you take an action. For example, it could be a sensitive termination that you're considering. It's always a good idea to reach out to a consultant or an attorney just to make sure that you have a defensible action that you're making. So good employee relations is the difference between these two groups. You either have a happy group of employees or you got a bunch of angry people going on strike. And the last thing is strategic planning. I mentioned this earlier as an HR competency, and I won't go too much into this, but I think that it's always a great idea for an organization, no matter how large or small you are, that you have a goal-setting process. And I think that a strategic plan, this is where your corporate strategy is put together, and you have a long-term plan that's going to go out 3 to 5 years. But those things trickle down. Those corporate initiatives and those corporate strategies, they go down throughout the organization, and then there should be a tie-in between what the organization is doing. It should trickle down through each department in the organization and ultimately down to each individual. So if you are setting goals and you're having a performance appraisal discussion, you want to set goals for next year, hopefully some of those goals will be right in line with what the corporate goals are. And then just a few comments there about goals themselves. I've seen too many goals that say, learn how to do this thing better or get some training in this area. That's fine and dandy, but you want them to be specific, measurable. You want to know that it's been completed, that it's attainable. You want to make sure somebody can actually do it. You don't want to demotivate them. That it's relevant, meaning it's something that they do as part of their job and they have control over it. And that it's time sensitive. I always suggest if you're putting a goal together, the last few words should be by this date, by the end of Q1, by the end of the year. The old saying is what gets measured gets done. And if you want a high performing organization, you should have a goal setting process throughout the organization. And again, I think this is somewhere that HR can really assist. So as far as, we've covered a lot here. This is pretty much the last slide. And, if you're participating here and you're listening to me, you're going to go, okay, well, that's all fine and dandy. You've told me all these HR competencies and you've laid out some of these major systems that I should have in place. What should you do next? I think it's a great idea for organizations to at some point in time, assess their HR capabilities. Step back and look and go, what are my capabilities in HR? Do I have strengths? Do I have a lot of risks and exposure? One way to do that, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, is oftentimes I get calls and they say, I go, well, how can I help you? Well, I don't know because I don't know what I don't know. I'm like, okay, well, there's one way to make sure you do know. We can do an HR audit. That's an example of one thing that if you feel as though your HR function may not be up to par, one way to determine is it or isn't it, or what your areas of strengths or weakness are, you can have an HR audit. It sounds bad because it's an audit. It's not. It's a very simple process where you basically assess a number of different systems and see if you have things in place or if you don't. Then usually you come out of that with, here are your areas of proficiency. Here's what you're good at, but here's a few areas where you could use some improvements or you're missing something altogether and you need to implement something. So I think that, this is not a commercial to have John Kuznia and Truman Solutions come out and help you. But if you're in a situation in an organization where you're not sure what your HR capabilities are, that's one way to determine if you can do that. Or consider hiring an HR person or training an existing person in all those competencies I mentioned before to literally give you some focus on the HR function. Those to me would be good next steps, I think, in terms of assessing your own capabilities. So this actually timed out fairly well. Hopefully we have enough time if there are any additional questions.
There are. There are a couple in the chat, so I'll
Good.
refresh. But if anyone has any to add, feel free to drop them in, and we'll try and get to them as well. I'm going to just go in order that they were asked. So give me one moment. Thoughts on fractional staffing, outsourcing HR specifically?
Hmm.
Is it effective? What are possible pitfalls to look out for?
Sure. Well, the fractional part isn't a bad idea because most organizations of a certain size don't need or can't afford a full-time HR function. So I think a fractional person, if you can find someone who wants to come in and do it on a part-time basis, who's an HR, professional, that's great. You could hire them as an employee on a part-time basis. Or again, you could hire, a consultant. There's plenty of HR consulting firms out there who will be your HR go-to person. They'll help you with basic systems. Once you get them in place, you're pretty much on autopilot until you need that old phone a friend. I've got a problem. I need an issue resolved. Who can I reach out to? So honestly, for small nonprofits, and to be honest with you, this is the primarily most of my clientele. They just want somebody they can call when they have an issue and they want to talk through it. So I'm a proponent of that. When you talk about RPOs and outsourcing, um, yes, if you're a larger organization, you want to outsource maybe just your recruiting or something like that, I think it would work fairly well. But it's not just because I'm a consultant in this space, but I hear from clients that we have someone doing this outsource stuff, but either we can't get a hold of them, we're not getting good service. And your employees, this is the problem, your employees know that it's not somebody who's in your organization. And it almost feels like we're not important enough to you for you to have a resource internally who actually works for you and for us. They see them as a hired gun almost, and it almost has the opposite effect. That's my opinion.
Great. Can you give an example of how a nonprofit can, quote, get into trouble, unquote, for not properly screening candidates during the resume review stage?
For not properly reviewing a resume. Well, certainly if you're in a regulated industry, and it could be human services, you may be hiring for a particular person that requires a certain credential, and then you hire someone because the resume says they have a credential. It'd be a good idea to go out there and verify that they've got that. There are services out there that will do educational verification. You want to make sure that, especially, again, not all organizations have this requirement, but if you do, you better make darn sure that you're meeting those requirements. During the screening process, I think one way and another way an organization get into trouble is that if your job description doesn't have a decent indication on working conditions, let's say, for example, a job requires somebody to be out in the field driving or something like that. You want to make sure when you're screening somebody that they understand that and they can do it. You may also have situations where you have certain physical requirements. Again, you may not have warehouses, but there may be other things that nonprofits do that require somebody to stand on their feet for a long time or lift a certain amount of weight. Your job description should mention that, and you should make sure that's part of your screening process. Because if you don't properly do that, you could find yourself in a difficult situation where an employee says, "You just hired me in this job. I'm telling you I can't lift more than 10 pounds, and you're telling me I got to lift more than 50." Now you're stuck in a situation, where you've potentially got an ADA claim or some other form of a disability claim. So there's plenty of ways to get in trouble, but usually most of the trouble comes after someone's hired, and then you terminate them. That's when most of the trouble starts.
The
Anything
next
else?
one, yeah, there's a couple more. What would you suggest as a range in differences in salary to ensure internal equity for compensation? 5,000, 10,000, etc. Some employees did not negotiate their rate when they accepted their jobs, others did. Now there's a gap between some, and figuring out how to navigate if we are unable to bring everyone up to the same level.
Yeah, yeah. It's hairy. It's really hairy. Whenever I do some of these, whenever I build a comp matrix, I will actually take an Excel spreadsheet. By the way, I used to be an accountant. I was a former CFO, so I love a good spreadsheet. But I'll put everybody on the spreadsheet and I'll put their pay in there, and I'll group them by all the same, if it's the same position or a similar position. What that ends up doing is it tells you what the range is that you're already paying. Then you go out and say, okay, is that range what the market is saying? Okay, good. Let's say, for example, it is. what ends up happening then is then you have to deal with, if there are internal inequities, and this is what it sounds like happened, is that there are internal inequities for the same role or similar positions. The only way that you can fix that is if somebody is higher than somebody else and you say maybe they shouldn't be, all you can do is provide less of an increase to this person and more of an increase to this person so that you can get to that point where there's better parity. Step one, though, is identifying what those inequities are. And I've even seen situations where somebody was so highly paid for some reason or another that nobody seems to remember how they got paid that much. But if you've got a range and they're at the top of it, there's a thing called red circling. And you literally have to tell that person for a couple of years, you're not going to get an increase because for this position, you're out of whack. It's not an easy discussion to have, but it's a fair discussion to have. And then that gives other people in that grade a little bit of time to catch up to them. So there's ways to deal with inequities. None of them are comfortable. This is where you need a good HR person to talk through it.
Definitely. All right, we've got two more questions that are related, and we can close out with these. What is the best resource for an executive director who is also responsible for HR functions in a small business? And then the second question was, what are resources for HR issues aside from calling a consultant? For us, that might be prohibitively pricey.
Yeah, sure. The first issue I had to do with, I'm sorry, how do you find an HR director?
Best
Oh, no,
resources
sorry, an executive
for
director with HR.
Yeah.
Listen, anybody who's going to be in the top spot of a role has got to have some competencies and experience in HR. If the person's going to be the executive director, they need to have program experience, right? For whatever your industry is. They need to have financial experience. They need to understand financial statements and how to keep the organization financially sustainable. They need to have HR experience. They've hired and fired people. They know how to organize. They know how to set up appraisals, all that kind of stuff. They also need to know a lot about fundraising, which many nonprofits do. So there's 5 or 6 key competencies that every executive director should have. So you shouldn't be hiring anybody who hasn't already been down the HR path. That's my opinion. The second question had to do with what other resources there might be. A lot of small nonprofits have payroll service companies, payroll service bureaus like a Paychex, an ADP, and there's GTM as a local one. A lot of these organizations actually are moving into the HR service area. And what they do is they just have a large warehouse of HR resources. So but it's very much a self-service kind of thing. You need to have somebody in the organization who knows how to use them. But that's one other opportunity is that go to a payroll service provider that you probably are already working with and ask them if they have those kind of resources. Oh God, there's a couple names that are escaping me that are very popular out there nowadays. And unfortunately, I can't give you any names because they're not coming to me. But they're basically big warehouses of all kinds of tools. And of course, if you join SHRM, you have access, SHRM, which is the Society for Human Resource Management, you have access to all of their resources and tools. But again, it's self-service, so sometimes having access to that can be a little dangerous. But at least that's one way to get some answers on a self-service platform. Hopefully that helped.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I did want to, we have one of our Nikon associates here, Susan Weinrich, also pointed out in many cases, you may have board members who can provide HR expertise or legal expertise, at least pointing you in the right direction for finding those resources. And then like highlighting Paychex again, as well as Mineral, which is an HR platform.
Yes, that's the name I was trying to think of.
Yep. And that is provided to our Council Services Plus clients. So if you are teamed up with them with some services, they might be able to connect
Wonderful.
you with Mineral.
And that's a very good point from Susan on the board. If your executive director is doing a good job of building a board, they're finding subject matter expertise in every board member that can contribute.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you so much for everything. As we mentioned, a recording of this will be distributed to all of our registrants as well as the slides. So if you have any questions, you can reply directly to that email and we'll try and connect you with the answer, especially if we didn't get to your question today. I think we got everybody, but just in case. And feel free to check out our upcoming webinars. John's going to have a second one coming out soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But otherwise, thank you so much for spending time with us and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
I appreciate everyone. Have happy holidays, and we'll be talking soon, I'm sure.